Oliver Stone, thank you very much for sitting down with me for this interview. I really do appreciate it.
Well, anybody called Primo NUTMEG deserves my attention.
Margaret Kimberley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I wanted to have you on for a while, and I know that we had a little bit of an issue around President's Day. I really wanted to have you on the show at that time. You're the author of a new book, Prejudential, and I wanted to speak with you today about that. However, there's so much news that's been going on that I really wanted to cover. Oh, you got a copy too.
I'll put it up to my head. No.
So I really do want to talk about your book. However, there's just so much news going on. I thought maybe we could start off just going over some topical issues. The first, of course, would be the coronavirus. That's been a major issue for the planet and for our country over recent weeks, with many different states, including here in Connecticut, doing this shelter-in-place initiative to try to keep people from going out. So I just would like your general thoughts. Do you think that the government is doing enough? Do you think that they're doing too much? Just what do you think about the response to the coronavirus?
Well, I think this drastic response was necessitated by the lack of response initially. It seems to me there are two things that we needed to keep this from becoming an emergency, where I and other people are now working at home, among other things. There should have been testing early, and I think there should have been masks. It's funny, we get mixed messages about things, and that's very frustrating. We're depending on experts, and people were initially saying, you don't need a mask, they don't help much, just keep washing your hands. And for someone like me who took the subway every morning, it seemed counterintuitive. I was like, well, how can it not help? My doctor said it could help, so he advised me to do it, so I've done it. But just having the test, or rather in this case, not having the test, the World Health Organization had a test, countries like China and Korea had a test. For some reason, the FDA decided to do its own, and for reasons that I do not understand, the test failed, they had to start over again. So the simplest thing that could have given guidance about how this disease was spreading, there was a tool we didn't have. And so now we're left in this kind of limbo where we don't know how fatal it is, but we know it does kill people, so you can't sneer at it. You can't, I'm not one of those who says it's overblown or it's just like the flu, because it's not. But because we have, I think the biggest issue is the infrastructure of this country is not built to help the people. And this is a very tragic example of that, where we don't have, it's a funny thing, we're always told this is an advanced country, it's a great country, it's the richest country in the world. And then when something that you would think would be simple for this advanced, great, rich country, like producing more masks or creating a test, isn't done, we see how badly off we are. We actually live in a failed state. And that's why people are now at home. I was out a little earlier. I live in New York City. I was on the subway. There are a few people on. You can actually practice social distancing on the New York City subway these days. But we're in this situation where people are unsure and afraid, and some people are dying because we have a for-profit health system. There's no room for error. So it seems if hospitals if they have an expectation of having 20 patients a month, let's say, who will need a ventilator, they don't have the bandwidth to take the 21st patient. So one of the things I hope happens, I hope that people stop bragging about America, stop talking about how wonderful this country is, great, advanced, etc., because it clearly is not. And we're in this situation. This situation tells us how badly off we are as residents of this nation, and the response also tells us how badly off we are. And this effort to help, this stimulus package, is another corporate giveaway. It's a measly $1,200 if you're lucky. If you make more than a certain amount, you don't get anything. If you owe child support arrears, you don't get anything. And it's a one-time payment for people who are now, many of whom are out of work. 3 million unemployment insurance claims in the past week, as opposed to 250,000 the previous week. So, but Canada, they're giving people $2,000 a month for 4 months.
What's also interesting is you have apparently the situation where there's some people actually profiting off of this. I saw a headline where Jeff Bezos apparently made some money off of coronavirus. There's also an instance with some senators as well. So what are your thoughts on that profiteering off of this worldwide disaster?
Well, that's what rich people do. That's how they get rich and how they stay rich. But we have a system that allows them to do whatever they want. So being a United States senator who hears first, before the rest of us do, how serious this could be and what the impact could be, they get to unload their stocks early. And I hope this is the end of people questioning whether or not we live in an oligarchy, because it's obvious that we do. But those people should be defeated. They should be, if they weren't going to face primary, if they weren't going to face a contest, they certainly should now. As for Bezos, the richest man in the world, whose workers at Whole Foods, Amazon now owns Whole Foods, are working without gloves, are working without masks, working without any of the protections they ought to have. So the oligarchs are in charge. And I hope the only debate is what to do about them, not whether or not that's a system that we live in.
What do you think explains the reemergence of Joe Biden, and also what explains his popularity among the African American community?
Well, Black voters are very risk averse. We will not support anyone unless we're convinced that that person can beat the Republican. For a variety of reasons, Black politics now amounts to little more than keeping Republicans out of office. Anybody who questions, who wants to demand, who wants to have a movement is ignored or shut up in favor of. And we're always told that, and it's even worse now that Trump is president, the only thing we can do is keep Republicans out of office because they are seen as such a threat to us. And it's logical for people to feel that way about them, but I don't think that this strategy is very useful. So all you needed to do to beat back Sanders and raise Biden up was to convince Black people that Bernie Sanders can't win. And there was a coordinated effort. I'm going to call it propaganda. We're propagandized about a lot of things in this country, which was, so people were told that, well, you may like what Bernie Sanders talks about. You may want Medicare for all, but white people don't want it, and white people aren't going to vote for him. So you have to vote for someone. Biden's always called a moderate, but he's very conservative. He's always a right-wing Democrat. And people were told they had to, he was the only choice to defeat, and the ability to beat the Republican is defined as getting white people to vote. And that even happened with Obama. In 2008, Black people were not solidly behind him till he won the Iowa caucuses, and it became clear that white people would vote for him. And then everyone gravitated towards him because they were convinced he could win. But this effort to say that that Bernie Sanders cannot win, that white people won't vote for him, was very successful. And people at Black Agenda Report, we refer to as the Black misleadership class, the politicians like Congressman Clyburn in South Carolina, who disparaged Bernie Sanders, and that's, you know, a more conservative state anyway. But to be told that Sanders can't win, that the only one that white people will vote for, therefore the only one you should vote for, is Biden. And this is just self-defeating. And nobody remembers what happened in 2016. We were all told that Hillary Clinton was the most electable, and Trump is the one in the White House. But I think for a variety of reasons, that's forgotten. I think RusiaGate was used very successfully in convincing people that they didn't have to question the Democrats. It was all some nefarious plot with an evil leader in another part of the world that put Trump in the White House, and not, as I am convinced, corruption which created incompetence in the Democratic Party. I believe Trump's election is entirely the fault of the Democrats. But nobody talks about that. So people listen, the same people who ought to be discredited now, the same people who should be ignored now, who told us all Hillary Clinton couldn't lose, are being listened to again. So I think that's what the support for Biden in the Black community is. I think that's what it is about. And as far as the larger Democratic Party, they had one goal this year. That was to make sure Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination. And that's why they had so many candidates. They wanted to see, you know, who would stick, throw them all up against the wall like mud and see who sticks, and then coalesce around that person. Sanders takes some of the blame too. He has not attacked Biden as he should have. It was, I think, a big mistake for him to say Biden could beat Trump. He was asked if Biden could beat Trump, and he said yes. He should have said maybe, but I can definitely beat Trump, but something, anything other than that. So that gave those people who were afraid anyway, it gave them a reason to doubt him. And I also think the smears against Bernie Sanders have been very successful. Hillary Clinton has never let up, blaming him for her loss. And for some reason, people still listen to her. I don't understand why. I don't know how you raise $1 billion, but you can't get 10,000 more votes in Michigan. But that's what we've been told. RusiaGate was cooked up because, in part, to excuse the Democrats of their failure. And there are many, many failures. They lost more than 900 seats in the House and in state legislatures across the country. And one of the arguments against Sanders was the Democratic establishment or this or that pundit or expert said, well, they'll lose seats if Sanders is the nominee. Well, these same people don't talk about how they managed to lose 900 seats when Obama was in the White House. So we have this situation where this man who was never very bright, who is very politically conservative, who is obviously ill. I don't know if he has dementia. I don't know what to call it, but he is not healthy. There's something wrong with him.
We need to activate the reserve corps of doctors and nurses and beef up the number of responders dealing with these crush of cases. And in addition to that, we have to make sure that we are in a position that we are. Well, let me go to the second thing. I've spoken enough of that. We can make a personal productive equipment. Look, here's the deal. We have to do what we did in the 40s and the 20s, the 2020s. And we can do that. We need to build a medical arsenal here. Third, the president needs to end the infighting and bickering with his own administration. Listen to the scientists and provide clear guidance. The American people are not getting clear leadership.
And now we have a woman who has apparently tried to come forward in the past with a story of sexual assault, but they're sticking with him and they're trying to hide him. Was supposed to be one more debate. Sanders says he will be in that debate. Biden and other Democrats say there's no reason for a debate, and everyone's trying to shut it down. We don't need any more debates. We don't need any more primaries. Millions of people haven't voted yet. Here in New York, we were supposed to have a primary in April, which has now been pushed back to June. How do millions of people not get the chance to vote? Biden's, I'm assuming you've seen his recent appearances. First, he disappeared for a while, and especially at this moment with the COVID-19 crisis and Trump's lack of leadership and his misstatements and lies, his usual. This would be, you would think, a time for the presumptive Democratic Party nominee to really step forward and show leadership, but they've been hiding him. And when you see the public appearances, even the softball interviews that he can barely get through, you can see why. And now there are these crazy rumors they're going to replace him with Andrew Cuomo. I have no idea how much validity there is to that. But this is a very crazy year because the Democrats are committed to making sure that there is no discussion of change. There is no discussion of even a tiny bit of liberalish reform. That they are going to stick with their neoliberal policies and keep us all under billionaire rule. And that's why we have ended up where we are.
That rumor actually was something else I wanted to ask you about. So this has been in the news or kind of online chatter recently, is that Andrew Cuomo or Hillary Clinton may replace Joe Biden because either he is ill or has dementia, or as you mentioned, just something is wrong with him. Or recently, as was exposed on the Katie Halper show, the claims by Tara Reade and what she's saying happened to her, how she was sexually assaulted and has been trying to speak out about it for years. This goes along with other allegations of sexual misconduct. Also, there's dozens of videos of Joe Biden on camera inappropriately touching women and children. So this isn't exactly a new thing, but it may blow up at a time where it undermines him winning the nomination. And there is this claim that Andrew Cuomo or Hillary Clinton or Michael Bloomberg or somebody may just swoop in and become the nominee. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because a lot of people also push back on that, saying that that would really just show how, the DNC is not democratic. That would really just undermine the entire process. People wouldn't accept it. So just what are your general thoughts on that narrative?
Well, we could see this before when it looked like when Sanders won the first few contests and it looked like he might be on his way to winning the nomination. They started saying something I have never heard in my entire life, and I'm 60 years old. They started saying that the nominee doesn't have to be the person who got the most votes, who comes to the convention with the most delegates. It doesn't have to be the person who got the most delegates. I'd never heard this before in my life. And the fact that they were so open about it. Now, Biden did have those string of victories, so he actually has more delegates. So I guess they're breathing a sigh of relief. But the fact that they were priming us to accept this obvious effort to rig the system and to do away with the system they always had is an indication of how serious they are about shutting progressives up and shutting progressives out. I don't know if they can get away with it or not. Democrats are so desperate to get rid of Trump, and all people have to be told often enough is that a certain thing will get rid of Trump. So at the same time as they try to defend Biden, they are also acknowledging that he's problematic. Why would you be even having this discussion? But I think it'll be interesting to see, but I think a lot of people would go for it if they were convinced. And we have all these people in the Democratic Party establishment who are doing all kinds of things, trying to prop up Biden, but still trying to hide him, but saying that we don't need any more voting. It's very obvious. So if they try to take Biden out and replace him, I think it will be a disaster. I'm convinced that the Democrats have painted themselves into a corner and Trump is going to win because they have put so much effort into defeating this one person and making sure he doesn't win and that he does not play any role at all. But I hope he doesn't drop out. He's apparently not raising money anymore, but he hasn't dropped out. He says he wants another debate. And I think it's important for him to stay in because last week I saw Biden tweeted, public college should be free. Now, that's something he never talked about before. This is an effort to get the support of Sanders people. But I think we're going to see a debacle of some kind. Things are very fluid. I don't know how exactly the debacle will take place. I don't know how you make somebody the nominee when nobody voted for them, when nobody did. I don't know. I thought maybe they'd try to make it Elizabeth Warren. I don't know, but it's going to be a mess because of their meddling and because of their determination to squash any efforts at progressive politics.
So one other thing on Tara Reade, she's now being attacked because I guess she had made some blog posts in the past that were somewhere favorable towards Putin or towards Russia. Just what are your general thoughts on that and the fact that, a year after the end of the Mueller investigation, Russophobia is still being politically weaponized like this?
Well, it helps. It works. You have Russia was their excuse. They could explain away the debacle of their own making. They got to censor people on the left. They got buy-in for very old school imperialist right-wing foreign policy, convincing people that Russia was this enemy and convincing people that there was no chance to have any kind of a peaceful coexistence with this other major nuclear superpower. And so it works. Now, about this time last year, Mueller wrapped up his investigation with no indictments for the collusion we'd been told about for 2 years. And then he went on in July although people like Adam Schiff insisted on having him testify. So last July he testified, and it was an absolute disaster. He couldn't explain himself. There were easy things he didn't want to answer. And I think it just proved what I and others had been saying all along, that RusiaGate was a tremendous fraud. But Trump, being Trump, resurrected RusiaGate the next day. So July 24th was Mueller's disastrous testimony. July 25th, Trump makes a stupid phone call to the Ukrainian president. He couldn't even, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, as it were. And he and Rudy Giuliani were convincing themselves that there were servers in Ukraine, something nobody else says, by the way. All the people who have debunked RusiaGate with facts, he comes up with this crazy idea and stupidly brings Joe Biden's name into a conversation with the newly elected Ukrainian president. And that leads to impeachment. It leads to RusiaGate being resurrected. So Trump himself is responsible for this. But of course, anybody who says anything other than Russians meddled in the election and they're going to meddle in this election again, they're already doing it, anyone who says anything other than that is smeared and demonized. So I was not aware of this, but it doesn't surprise me. I don't know that this Russophobia inspired by the RusiaGate fraud will ever disappear. It's too convenient. It's too easy. Even before the 2016 election, we had been told that Putin was, this evil adversary. So and with the corporate media going along with it, with all Democrats going along with it, with especially liberals being, I don't know if they're convinced or just try to convince us that Hillary Clinton lost because, of Russia and, they hacked in. Actually, there's no proof. It's a longer story, but I figure I'll mention it while we're on the subject. There's no proof that anybody hacked in the DNC. What happened was a leak. WikiLeaks gets leaks. Somebody at the DNC leaked emails to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But that's another story. So no, I'm not surprised that people would continue to use this against anybody they want to discredit. And it just shows you what trash most liberals are. First, it was Me Too and always believe women, always believe women. But unless the woman reports being sexually assaulted by the presumptive Democratic Party nominee, then she has to be discredited and smeared somehow.
Well, that was another aspect of the story that was revealed by The Intercept, was that Tara Reade actually went to Time's Up and asked them to support her for these sexual assault allegations, and they refused to because of the election. That was their reasoning. It seems as though all of these sexual assault allegations are always viewed through the lens of partisan politics and not the actual claims themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. We can go back to Juanita Broderick, who said Bill Clinton raped her, and I believe her. And at the time I said, well, I don't know, I'm not so sure, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't just believe her. There's no reason to think she would lie. Trump has been accused of rape, and we're all supposed to believe the woman who accused him. I don't see any reason not to believe her either. But a lot of these organizations, these liberal organizations, they're tied at the hip with the Democratic Party. And so they follow the party line. And so I'm not surprised that Time's Up would have done this. And Joe Biden is creepy. I mean, we have years of these photos and videos. He's touching people inappropriately. People are clearly uncomfortable. And his racist remarks. I'm sure you've heard about him, saying when he worked at a pool, first he had a fight with a black man named Corn Pop, who actually probably did exist. But then he said black kids like to look at the blonde hair on his legs, and he learned about roaches from them. I mean, it's just insane. It's the sort of thing you'd expect Trump to say. Mm-hmm. I've always believed that a lot of the outrage about Trump is more because he's a Republican. It's because of who he is and because he's such a vile person overall. Excuse me. But so they're willing to forgive racist statements, sexist actions, sexist statements. I mean, look at Biden's record, the treatment of Anita Hill, this woman's story of sexual assault. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but they've chosen him. And so anybody who says you shouldn't choose him, anybody with anything negative to say about him, even if it's true, is going to be smeared. And so I'm not surprised that this happened.
So something else that I kind of want to talk about, I'm a little hesitant just because it's among my audience been kind of controversial, and I actually lost a bunch of subscribers over it, but was the fact that Tulsi Gabbard recently endorsed Joe Biden, even as the election is still going on. And the reasoning that you hear from Tulsi Gabbard in the video that she made and also from her supporters is that the election is effectively over. Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. She signed a agreement that she had to endorse the nominee, and that with coronavirus, it's not good to have people going out and voting, and that Bernie Sanders is also going to endorse Joe Biden eventually. So you can't be mad at Tulsi for something that Bernie is also going to do. The thing that I just have a hard time with is that, this really went against everything that Tulsi said that she stood for the past year, endorsing a corrupt, senile war criminal. Additionally, just the language that she used too, saying that he'll be guided by the spirit of aloha and he'll bring our country together. Like, she didn't sign any pledge to make those kinds of ridiculous statements. So I'm just wondering if overall what was your reaction when you saw that Tulsi Gabbard had endorsed Joe Biden?
Well, I was surprised and I was very disappointed. I was not a supporter of hers, but her signature issue is war and regime change wars. And she's one of the reasons I was not a strong supporter is that on the one hand, she talks about being a soldier and how important that is. But she's against these regime change wars because they're bad for American soldiers. So it was not like a real left-wing talking point. But that was her issue. It was war. And Biden is a hawk. Biden voted for the war in Iraq. He bragged about voting for the war in Iraq. As Obama's vice president, he was in favor of destroying Libya. He was in favor of the attempted destruction of Syria. He was the point person in Ukraine, the country where an elected president was overthrown by far right, some even Nazi elements in that country. And then he got his son a good gig, after having participated in this regime change, which has been an absolute disaster for Ukraine. So for her to endorse Biden was a slap in the face to people who supported her. You can't just treat people like chumps. And that's what she did. So people who are angry with her have every right to be angry with her. You can't make people feel like fools. She didn't have to endorse him. She couldn't get into the debates. There's, some talk of her, Bernie didn't defend her right to be in debates. And okay, we could say he was wrong to have done that, but none of that forced her to endorse Biden. She could have ended her campaign without endorsing him. Elizabeth Warren still hasn't endorsed anybody. She didn't have to endorse Biden. So I'm thinking that some kind of deal was made. And that if he becomes president, she will get something that she wants. But people had every right to be angry with her, and people should call her on it, because that is just such blatant disrespect and treating people like they're fools, treating people like they're stupid. And as for Bernie, apparently they all took a pledge of some kind to endorse and support the nominee. So Bernie may do that, but that doesn't let her off the hook either. So if he does it, you can be mad at him too. I don't think people should let her off the hook. So I believe that she deserves the condemnation that she's received.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing about this race is that there's always been this kind of Bernie supporters versus Tulsi supporters animosity, and you've seen that bubble up a couple of times. And what hasn't come through is that Tulsi Gabbard is imperfect, Bernie Sanders is imperfect, but they're both speaking about things that nobody else is speaking about, and that's what made them valuable in the race. It's not that Bernie Sanders is great and we should all get behind him. It's that he's talking about things that no one else is talking about. Right.
Exactly. He's talking about, the suffering that we're seeing in the wake of the economic impact of COVID-19. It's exposing what Bernie Sanders has been talking about, that there are so many Americans who go broke because they get sick, who end up thousands of dollars in debt from student loans, who have low wage work. These are issues that were considered forbidden and nobody was supposed to talk about them. On foreign policy, one of the reasons I'm not I prefer him, but I'm not a Democrat anymore. I'm a Green Party member. On foreign policy, he sounds like everybody else, and he goes along with the Russia bashing too, and that is very disappointing. This is an opportunity for him to really change a lot of different paradigms. But people get very emotional about their candidates, and too much so. There's too much identifying with that person. And that's something people need to stop doing. I'm hoping that Sanders supporters don't just disappear if he does drop out, if he does endorse Biden. We need to stop asking what Bernie's going to do and ask them, what are you going to do? There needs to be a break in the Democratic Party. Progressives must break with the Democratic Party once and for all. But people get tied up. And it's also because people react to their candidates being attacked and vilified. And so in this country, rather than just attack the person's policies, you attack that person. So Bernie Sanders is smeared as the person who's responsible for Trump winning. It's his fault that Hillary Clinton lost, which is so stupid. And there's nothing about having a primary challenge that kept her from winning. In 2008, Obama and Hillary Clinton had this knockdown, drag-out primary fight that went on forever. It didn't end until almost close to the convention. He went on to win comfortably. But so there was nothing about Bernie's challenge, and it wasn't even as close, frankly, as the Obama-Clinton race. So she still could have won, but that's her excuse. And I think people are angry when not only is it the person they respect and admire gets trashed, but they in turn are trashed. So if you dare to talk about inequality, dare to talk about low-wage work in this country, then you're trashed as being stupid, as being naive, as being the person to blame for Trump winning. So I think all of these things get personalized more than they should.
So again, I did want to get to your book, but just one last question on the presidential race, because one story that I did break on this show was when I had Howie Hawkins on, and he is the presumptive Green Party nominee. He's running against Dario Hunter, but I think he's always, he's had support from some leaders within the Green Party. And a pretty big following as well. But one story that I broke on this show is when I interviewed him, he seemed to adopt some aspects of the RusiaGate narrative, saying that Trump did collude with Putin.
I'd just be interested overall, what are your thoughts on the way that Jill Stein has been treated by the corporate media following the 2016 election?
Well, I was part of an advisory group to Jill, and I advised her not to go to that RT thing.
Why?
And in fact, I thought it was a setup. RT is, Russian propaganda. There's a lot of good programming on it, and they don't really interfere with that. Chris Hedges, Larry King, I don't know if Larry's still on there, Tom Hartman. But there's also, when the news comes from central headquarters, they get all kinds of crazy conspiracy people on there. Old LaRouche people, the Lyndon LaRouche,
right.
Conspiracy people and others. So I didn't trust them, and actually another person said, they could take a picture that would just overshadow everything you say. And she thought she'd give a message. She was encouraged by a lot of people in the peace movement, so she went. And that picture, Putin, you said she sat down with Putin. No, Putin sat down at the table with her for just a few minutes.
Right.
Picture snapped. Flynn is there. She don't know Flynn. Nobody knows Flynn. And Putin leaves. And then Sputnik International, another state media, puts it out on the media. And then, what's their purpose? Divide us in this country, the liberals from the more radical elements. And then MSNBC, CNN, Fox put that picture out there, and a lot of print media, again and again and again. They're doing it for Russian propaganda. That was what the Russians wanted. I mean, it's so ironic. The media is, they're following this RusiaGate thing, which I think is serious. I think Trump ought to be impeached. I think it's obvious he saw collusion. He did collude, him and his son and his son-in-law. And, it's all over that first volume of the Mueller report. It's all over there. I mean, when people say, oh, it showed no collusion. No, it didn't. It says, Mueller says right away, I didn't talk about collusion. I talk about narrow legal definition of conspiracy. Plus, I can't indict a president, according to this OLC letter in the Justice Department. He just laid out the evidence for prosecutors, which has to be Congress.
Just also some of the comments he made about Jill Stein being at the RT dinner, also about Julian Assange. They seemed as though they weren't really congruent with what you would expect of the Green Party to be presenting, especially in the election following RusiaGate, when you see a lot of these, a lot of this Russophobia being directed towards the left, towards Jill Stein specifically, but also the Green Party. And it was kind of strange to see Howie Hawkins embrace a little bit of that. I understand that, that's been kind of walked back a little bit, and he's really emphasized the message that RusiaGate has been a distraction. But just what are your overall thoughts on Howie Hawkins and how he's, talked about some of those issues? Do you think that he really is the best person for the Green Party to be nominating in 2020?
Well, I've made some pretty strong statements about RusiaGate. I've made it clear where I stand. I think it's all a fraud. As far as Howie, that's for him to answer. Assuming it's not pushed back like everything else, the Green nominating convention will be in early July, and the decision will be made there. I think what's important in all these issues is for people in a party to make clear what it is that they want and what they expect of their leadership or their nominees. I think that's the point. That's most important. Nobody should change their opinions because of what a candidate says, and then it happens. You have to weigh. You have a difference of opinion on a particular issue that you may feel strongly about, but it's a matter of weighing all of the issues that he or anybody else speaks on: their domestic policy, their economic policy, the Green New Deal. All of these things are important to Greens. And I think people will have to weigh how strongly they feel with what he's saying, make clear what they expect of a nominee, and then sometimes there's a debate, sometimes there's a fight. But I don't see it as something impossible to overcome for the party or for him if he is the nominee. And I think it's important to pay attention to what he's saying now about it and what he's saying about foreign policy. And that's, foreign policy is very important to Greens. It's one of the things that takes people out of the Democratic Party. If you care about peace, if you don't want regime change wars, then you can't be a Democrat either. So I think that's why his comments resonated so much. It's a big issue for Greens, but I think he's heard it. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens at the convention.
So, as I mentioned, you are the author of a new book called Prejudential, and Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents.
Put it up into my head again.
Oh, there you go. So, what caused you to want to write this book?
A few years ago, I wrote a column in my Black Agenda Report column about Theodore Roosevelt. And this was sparked by, I had watched a public television documentary about the Roosevelts. And, and people like him, they're subject matter because the person who does it obviously admires them. So I believe that this documentary covered up a lot of things. He was an open white supremacist. He talked about his white navy going around the world. He was an arch imperialist. He said white women were obligated to have babies and keep, he really did say that, keep white people in control of the world. So I wrote about this truth that had been covered up in this particular program. And a Black Agenda Report friend and supporter said to me, "Why don't you write about all the presidents?" And I maybe impulsively said yes. I'd never written a book before. I probably didn't know I was getting into. It's a lot of hard work. But so that is how it started. And this is what I came away with after spending a couple of years researching these 45 people. America's foundation as a settler colonial state tells us a lot about what has happened throughout history, and it tells us a lot about the present day. The country was founded based on genocide, first of the indigenous population, then of chattel slavery. And so the foundations of this country are very racist, and anti-Black racism is foundational. Of the first 12 presidents, 10 were slaveholders. And this played a huge role in American history. And these are things that aren't discussed. So, for example, I was always taught that Washington, D.C. was a new city and it was built on the Potomac. But why build a new city and why locate it there? Well, they wanted a capital that was safely within those states that depended more on the plantation economy. So this new city was created wedged between Maryland and Virginia. When Washington the first capital was New York City. Washington was inaugurated here in New York City. Then it moved to Philadelphia. But as a slaveholder, he had a problem. The state of Philadelphia had a law that said any enslaved person who was there for 6 months could become free. So Washington, and he did this in violation of that state's laws, he had to rotate the several hundred enslaved people that he and his wife owned. And so no one was allowed to stay in Philadelphia for 6 months. They'd send them back to Mount Vernon and bring someone else up. And it's that kind of history that is just not taught to Americans. And most historians, I believe, are guilty of wanting to defend the status quo, defend the system that we're in. So they are loath to bring up anything that makes their subjects, puts them in a bad light. So Abraham Lincoln never gave up his dream of sending Black people out of the country. He talked about it as late as a week before he was assassinated. And even people were told to admire, like FDR, lest we forget at the time, the Democrats were the party of the segregated South. And Democrats like Roosevelt would use them as their excuse for inaction. So there were decades where there was an effort to have anti-lynching legislation, but Roosevelt didn't do that either. And it was always, I wish I could, but I need Southern support. I mean, and that lasted up until the 60s. Kennedy was not a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. He first met with Martin Luther King in secret. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, was even worse. He hated the Freedom Riders, hated the March on Washington. And it was only the efforts of the people, this mass movement that wouldn't die, that got us the civil rights legislation under Johnson. So he gets credit for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but it was the movement from below which forced him to do it. And so we go on and on and on, and we see even Democrats. We see Bill Clinton, who gave a lot of power to the mass incarceration effort, who executed a Black man, a mentally disabled Black man during his campaign, who had this horrible photo op with Black men in prison garb to make the case that he was tough on crime, the Sister Souljah moment with Jesse Jackson, the welfare reform, so-called reform, which pushed millions of people into poverty. All of these things were done by Democrats. Obama was very conservative too. He bailed out the banks, but didn't bail out the people. His foreign policy of destroying Libya, the most prosperous country in Africa. And then we have the presidents, and Trump's not the first, who got support by making racist appeals. Ronald Reagan did it with stories of welfare queens and a strapping young buck with food stamps and talk of states' rights in Mississippi. Trump, the thing that makes him different is that he dispenses with the code words, the winks, the nudges, and he just came out and said it and was popular because of it. So, but here we are today, as I was saying before, we end up with these terrible presidents in part because all Americans are dissuaded from being politically active in any way other than voting. So Black people especially are now told the only thing we can be is passive observers and just wait to see who white people will vote for in the Democratic Party, and that's the one we should support. And there's no other Black politics left that's worth our efforts. And so we end up with Trump, and we could end up with him again. But I think the story of the 45 presidents and their treatment of Black people tells us a lot about the country and explains a lot about where we are here in the 21st century.
Absolutely. I thought it was a wonderful book. I read it cover to cover. It's one of those books that you just can't put down. And I thought right from the get-go, the first few sentences in your book are, children learn in school that George Washington's false teeth were made of wood. That is not true. Some of his dentures were made of ivory and metal, but some of them came from human beings he owned. And just right there from the get-go, you understand the legacy of racism that's really swept under the rug. Could you maybe just speak a little bit more about George Washington, because he is one of those presidents that's universally revered. Republicans and Democrats both look up to him. He's the father of our nation. There's kind of an understanding that, yes, he did own slaves, but that was the thing at the time, I guess, and that's kind of overlooked. And we're told not to focus on that so much, but the fact that he helped create this nation that was conceived in liberty and eventually ended up in providing liberty for everyone. So what would your response be to that narrative?
Well, the nation was founded based on white supremacy, and the story of the teeth, he had transplanted teeth that were taken from some of the people he owned. And this stuck with me because any of us who've had a tooth extracted, even today with pain medicine and modern medicine, it's brutal. And for somebody to take the teeth out of your mouth to, transplant them into someone else, it's horrible. But that's what chattel slavery was like, a physical brutality that was practiced by 12 different presidents. And but the stories about the cherry trees and the founding fathers are all used to keep us from asking questions. They are used to prop up the system. They are used to keep us from asking questions or demanding more. If you're told this is the best of all possible worlds, we're the best country, we're the greatest country, even today, it's, during the impeachment hearings there, every member of Congress, all the Democrats, even the Black people, it really was very distressing to me to see Black people who should have known better extolling the virtues of the founding fathers who were slavers. But that's what we're stuck with now. But we have to question it. We have to ask. We have to acknowledge that the nation was not conceived in liberty. It was conceived in genocide. And Americans are very quick to ask other people to atone for their sins. So we're always asked if the Germans have atoned for the Holocaust. And did the Japanese, have they apologized over the sex slaves during World War II? Well, the same thing could be asked of this country as well. And but people are loath to do that. And it's easier to talk about how wise and wonderful these people were who practiced so many terrible cruelties. And actually, it's interesting, that is always the excuse that so-and-so is a person of their times, which means you're supposed to shut up about something horrible they did. But there were people at the time who questioned slavery. There was a man named, he was Polish, Kosciuszko, who fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a slaveholder himself, but he questioned it. And he, after many discussions with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson always, his excuse was always money. I can't afford to, give up these people I own. So Kosciuszko left money in his will to Thomas Jefferson. And he said, use this money to free the people that you own. Well, he dies, he leaves this will, but Jefferson never did it. So I think it's important to know what a horrible man Jefferson was also, and also to point out that there were always questions. There were always, and these are the people who should be held up as heroes. Rather than cover up for people who did so many horrible things, I think it's important to talk about the people who went against the grain, the Kosciuszkos, the people who, I've been telling people since I've been promoting the book, if there's a white man from the 1800s you want to admire, it ought to be John Brown, who his raid on Harper's Ferry was an attempt to start a slave insurrection. And the insurrection failed, and he was caught and executed. But he hastened the beginning of the Civil War, which I believe was the only way for slavery to end. So those people who are loath to give up their heroes, my response is find new heroes. We have to have a new criteria for who we admire and respect. And it should not be these people who did such horrible things, who either actively participated in genocides. People ask me who my least favorite president is or who was the worst. I always say Andrew Jackson. But I think it's a case of bad and less bad, frankly, or those who just went along because it was expedient. Being racist is not a political loser in this country. And unless there's some pushback, they all fall into that to some degree or other, including Obama, who very often and still does scold Black people because he knows it's something white people like to hear. So that's my argument. Let's find new people to respect. Let's lift up those people who fought against wrongdoing. And let's start talking about the country we should have instead of we're still covering up. We still have this country that gives people a maximum of $1,200 when there's this economic calamity, but gives billions of dollars to corporations. And it's impossible to fight against that if you're always talking about how great America is. It's hard for people to see that and speak to that.
I did just want to touch on Abraham Lincoln, because there's this narrative around him that he freed the slaves, he sympathized with enslaved Africans and wanted them to be free, and the Civil War led to the abolition of slavery. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So, what would your critique of Abraham Lincoln be?
Well, he was another liar. He would say things like, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. But he was not against slavery. The Republican Party, this new party at the time, was devoted to stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. Some Republicans were abolitionists. They were called radical abolitionists. He was not one of them. He said he wanted to keep the Union together. That was more important to him than keeping slavery. He famously said if he could keep the Union together by keeping slavery, he would do that, or by getting rid of slavery, he would do that. But it was enslaved people themselves who pushed the issue. Once the war began, which the South started, by the way, once the war began, every time Union troops entered a region, the enslaved people would rush for the Union line. So they're the ones who made it a war against slavery. And as I said before, Lincoln never gave up. His dream was to get Black people out of the country. And we're told that he said that in the beginning, but he changed his mind. He stopped saying it. He never stopped saying it. There was actually a colony in Haiti, a tiny island called Ile La Vache off the coast of Haiti, where 400 so-called contrabands, people who had fled slavery during the war, were sent. It didn't last long. They weren't well provisioned. Illnesses and death, and the survivors were brought back. But he signed this executive order, I guess you could call it that, the day before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and he considered colonization to go along with emancipation. He wanted Black people to leave the country, and he never stopped saying that that's what he wanted. So yes, he was a smart man, overcame poor education, so many different things, and he became this great wartime leader. that's all true. But what I've also said is true. And but as I've said before, people, we have to tell the truth about everyone. And if someone's going to, get the vapors and faint because they want to think of Lincoln as some kind of a saint, well, too bad for them. Let's talk about the people who we should revere. Let's talk about the people, the radical abolitionists, because they did exist, the enslaved who freed themselves. Let's talk about these people who fought for justice throughout American history.
And just to return to Teddy Roosevelt, there is a narrative around him that he did break the mold and ending racism in some important ways. There's a story when he was the New York City Police Commissioner where there was a racist preacher who was coming to town, and he appointed a bunch of Jewish police officers to guard him. That was kind of his way of making a statement there. He also appointed the first Jewish cabinet member, Oscar Strauss, as the Secretary of Commerce and Labor. He also famously had a dinner with Booker T. Washington, and that was really seen as inappropriate at the time, having a black man over for dinner at the White House. So again, there is this sort of myth around him that he helped end racism in the United States in important ways. So what would your response to that be?
Well, he did. The Booker T. Washington story is very funny. He, he was a, old money, noblesse oblige kind of guy. And Booker T. Washington was the flavor of the month black person at the time. He was the person in charge of patronage for any black person to get a decent job. So he invites him to the White House, but there was this uproar from the Southern segregationists, and neither man was prepared for the reaction. But at the same time, Roosevelt did something really quite shameful. A group of black soldiers in Texas, once they were stationed in Brownsville, Texas, they were under constant attack. They were accused of a murder. And at the time, the Republican Party was the Black People's Party, lest we forget, still the party of Lincoln. He waited until after Election Day in 1906 to get black votes for the Republicans. And then a couple of days later, he court-martialed all these men. And so that's also true. So, but I say just tell it all and let's debate it all. I think that's the way forward, not to hide anything, not to try to prop people up and pretend they didn't do things they actually did. And I think it explains something I touched on before about people being personalizing their political beliefs and their attachment to certain individuals. We seem to think that we have to love people and turn them into saints in order to support them or to respect them. And we see that a lot. So people are loath to talk about anything that would put their idol in a bad light. And that's something we have to change.
And then lastly, I just wanted to ask you about Lyndon Johnson, because he did sign these important pieces of civil rights legislation.
Well, I suppose you could give him credit for doing those things, but I believe there are millions of more people who deserve credit. But like a lot of people, even as he did the right thing with one hand, he didn't do the right thing with another. So, for example, in 1964, during the Democratic Convention that was in Atlantic City that year, there was a group from Mississippi, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, led by Fannie Lou Hamer, who came to the convention demanding to be seated instead of the segregated delegation. And they were under great pressure to go away, to disappear, to compromise. Even Martin Luther King was urging them to compromise. Lyndon Johnson was urging them to compromise. And when Fannie Lou Hamer was on primetime television talking about how she was brutally beaten by police in Mississippi, the Johnson administration cut her off the air. And said people thought he was going to talk about his running mate or something, but it was some BS about the 9-month anniversary of JFK's assassination, anything to get her off the air. And she and others were spied on. The FBI had them under surveillance, had King under surveillance, knew everything that was being said and planned. So there was a certain point, and even those presidents who would sometimes do the right thing, if a position was pushed that they felt that they did not want, they could behave in the same way. So Johnson would turn into the old school Southern segregationist that he always was. But it's the Fannie Lou Hamers who are the heroes of these stories. And so next time, 1968, the Democratic delegation from Mississippi was all black, or nearly all black, because of her. And but that's why it's so important to keep up the pressure on these people. That's why it's so important to have mass movements. We can't, I think we have to see politicians, even the ones we respect, we have to see them in a adversarial light, because there's so much pressure on them not to do the right thing. And the pressure they need from us to do the right thing cannot end. And we can't see ourselves as these passive observers, and every couple of years they let us vote, and that's the most we can do, and we can't be unrealistic, and we have to accept the lesser of the two evils, and we can't demand or think about anything better. And I think that's part of Bernie Sanders' appeal, that he dares to say, this is not the best we can have. We can have something different. And I think that's why there's so many people who are so attached to him. But as I said earlier, I hope they're not just attached to him, and I hope they're attached to the idea that we can have change in this country and have a country that really works in the interests of people. And I hope people who support him can rise to that occasion.
So one last question regarding your book, since you mentioned that Andrew Jackson was your least favorite president or the worst president, I do have to ask, who do you think was the best or the least worst?
The least worst. I've stopped thinking in those terms so much. It's hard for me to answer that question. I mean, as far as Black people were concerned, I don't know. I can't come up with anybody, to be honest. I can't say. I don't want to give anybody that that much credit. I mean, somebody obviously passed the slaveholding system, past the days of segregation. So who would that be? I don't know. Gerald Ford.
Fair enough.
No, that's a lie. He was at the time, busing for school integration was the hot issue, and every politician, Democrat and Republican, proclaimed their opposition to busing. Jimmy Carter did. He famously made this statement about ethnic purity and keeping the ethnic purity of neighborhoods, and he was against busing, forced busing. That's what they all said. So I can't name anybody.
Well, let me ask you this. In researching U.S. history and obviously knowing a lot about U.S. history as well, do you think that there are any certain points in time where the U.S. really could have turned a corner if someone else had been elected to office, or just if something else had been done in a really important way? I mean, did that kind of come up at all during your research for this book? Yes,
I think the period of Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner, slaveholder, very racist man. He stood in the way of, we did get those 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments after the Civil War, but Reconstruction could have survived and could have accomplished so much more if Lincoln had been succeeded by someone other than Andrew Johnson. He's a pivot, in a bad way, a pivotal figure. I think, so he's the first one to come to mind. I think if we had who else would I name? If Roosevelt had, in his last term, his vice president was Henry Wallace, who was very progressive, and they got rid of him in favor of Harry Truman. And then he died a few months after being elected that fourth time. And we got Harry Truman, who was from Missouri, a segregationist. And it would have meant a lot to have a real progressive in the presidency instead of Truman. Truman did desegregate the military. He was advised, quite rightly, that he should appeal to those Black people who could vote in the North, and that's one of the reasons he eked out this very close election victory in 1948. So it would have been much better for the country, for Black people, and for the whole country if Henry Wallace had been the vice president that last FDR term instead of Truman. Those were and Obama, people wanted change. George W. Bush was very unpopular at the time, at the end of his second term. The Iraq War was very unpopular, and to have somebody who was not beholden to those interests like Obama was, that was a moment when people were ready for more. Obamacare, if you criticize Obama, that's what are you always told? Yeah, but Obamacare, we got Obamacare. But we could have gotten more. He could have helped the people. He did not have to just bail out the banks and leave the people hanging. So he is also someone who could have really staked out a place in history. But that's not what he was interested in.
I did want to ask you a couple of questions from my patrons.
Sure.
My patrons, for just $1 a month, they are able to submit questions directly to my guests. So
Okay.
The first one comes from Janet. Janet writes, in light of the lesser evil arguments this election cycle, what do you think will be the impact on new Jim Crow if Joe Biden or someone handpicked by the DNC won in 2020?
It's going to continue. What would be his incentive for change? Black people are being herded back into the Democratic Party, being told to back the worst person possible, and that if we don't back this person, if we question anything at all, then Trump stays in. So having a Biden presidency, I think, would be a disaster. He's always been conservative. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be. We are, in fact, being urged to support him to continue these conservative policies that Democrats hide behind. So I think it would be a very bad thing.
And then the other question I had for you was from John. John writes, are you still planning to launch a YouTube channel with Danny Haiphong? His work is fantastic. I wish
Yes.
that his fact-finding trip to China with Cynthia McKinney debunking the neocon propaganda about Uyghur concentration camps was getting way more coverage than it is in independent media. This new Cold War with China is dangerous for the world.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so wonderful. Thanks for the shout out. Yes, we are. We have to, it's been more my fault than Danny's that we haven't gotten off the ground. We finally have, it's like basic logistic stuff. We had to get equipment. We've got to find a place where we can record. But Danny's has been holding it down on the YouTube channel. He is a co-author of a great book about American exceptionalism. So people should be on the lookout for him. But yes, we absolutely are. We are really going to ramp that up shortly.
Yes, Danny was actually recently a guest on my show as well. I think he was on episode 197 or thereabouts. That's a great book out as well. For folks out there who would like to follow you and who would also like to pick up a copy of your book, how can they do that?
I'm on Twitter. My Twitter name is Freedom Ride Blog, one word. I also have a column. I'm an editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report. So every Wednesday we publish a new issue, blackagendareport.com. My book, Prejudential, you can get on Amazon, or you can order through the publisher, Steerforth Press, steerforthpress.com. There is, it's a paperback and the Kindle version and an audiobook narrated by yours truly. So you can get the Kindle or audiobook on Amazon, especially now that everybody's at home more than they want to be. It's a perfect time to get to buy a new book.
Well, Margaret Kimberley, thank you very much for being on this episode. I really do appreciate it. Again, this was a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it reading it cover to cover. I think it's an important contribution. So thank you very much for writing this book, and thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.